This morning our scripture reading is from the book of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, this is the 3rd day since all of this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scripture to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread.
Have you ever just looked right at something and not actually seen it? I feel like this happens sometimes when we're looking for something. Like, have you ever looked for your phone while you're holding your phone in your hand? Or looked for your glasses while they're sitting on top of your head? I feel like this happens an awful lot, stereotypically to men, but I think it can happen to anyone, when you try to find something in the refrigerator. And you know it's there, and you actually look right at it, but you don't see it. For me, this is almost always the canned Parmesan cheese. I think it's my brain subconsciously saying, don't eat that junk, get the real stuff and grate it. It's not that hard, and it tastes so much better. But I'm looking for like a blue thing, and it's green. I'm looking for something that's green, is blue, and I look right at it. I can see it right in the center of my field of vision, but I don't actually recognize it. This seems to be exactly what happens to these two disciples, Cleopas and his friend, while they are walking to Emmaus. Jesus shows up, who is the person that they would love to see, and they do not recognize him. What is it that could account for this inability to see something that they're looking right at? I think there are a few hypotheses we could offer. One is that they may have never actually seen Jesus before. They could have been disciples who were following Jesus on the basis of his reputation, but never actually saw him until maybe they observed the crucifixion, when he would have been horrifically disfigured after the torture that he had endured. Or maybe the resurrection changed Jesus' appearance in a profound way. think we get a hint of this in the Gospel of John, right? Mary also encounters Jesus but mistakes him for the gardener. So maybe Jesus looked different after the resurrection than he did before the resurrection. But the text actually points us in a different direction. The text suggests that they were kept or prevented from recognizing him, or that their eyes were kept from seeing him. And the passive voice is interesting. What is it that is preventing them or keeping them from seeing and recognizing Jesus? Maybe it's God. Maybe God is blinding them for some reason so they can have this experience. Or maybe it's something internal to them, some internal psychology that they're looking at something that they should recognize and yet they don't actually see it. All throughout Lent and now into Easter, we've been thinking about this idea of the journey of faith as a journey of discipleship, of following after Jesus. This is the summons that Jesus extends to people during his earthly ministry. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And so if we're going to be people who are serious about following Jesus, then we need to be people who can recognize Jesus. We need to be able to look at Jesus and see, this actually is Jesus. This is the one we're supposed to be following. And so it's worth asking in our own lives of faith and discipleship, our own attempts to follow Jesus, what are the things that keep us from recognizing Jesus? And Luke is a little bit cryptic in his telling of the story. He doesn't tell us exactly why these disciples are unable to recognize Jesus at first. So we have to do a little bit of work, a little bit of digging into the scripture to try to understand what are the things that keep these two disciples from recognizing Jesus, and might they inform our own ability or inability to recognize Jesus. And I think from context clues and doing a little bit of historical work, we can point to some things that could have prevented these disciples from recognizing Jesus. Some things about their own lives, their own experiences, their own psyches that would have made it difficult to look at Jesus and to see this is Jesus. The first we might just simply call unmet expectations. They say this in the text. We had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. We had a certain expectation about this man and this movement, that God was going to do something as a result of what this person was up to in our community, in our culture, in our society. We hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. And Jesus, prior to his crucifixion, probably helped shape this expectation. Remember, Jesus keys his own actions to the Passover. This is when he chooses to enter into Jerusalem, what we often call the triumphal entry, this processional of Jesus on the donkey coming in. He's coming in at the feast of Passover. He gathers his disciples for a meal that we now commemorate as communion and structures it as a Passover meal. And what is the Passover? It's the opportunity to retell the Exodus story, the story of the children of Israel being delivered up out of bondage from Egypt and into freedom. It's a story of liberation. It's a story of being rescued from oppression. And it's a story of violence. All of Pharaoh's army is drowned in the sea. And this would have been the standard expectation that Cleopas and this other disciple and most of their contemporaries would have had. That God was going to act dramatically to rescue them from their oppression at the hands of the Romans, and not just the Romans, but some of their own rulers as well. God was going to act dramatically to rescue them. This was the expectation. And Jesus' death did not look like that. It did not look like a triumphal victory achieved through military means over the occupying forces. And so they had this one set of expectations. We hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. But then the reality did not match those expectations. And so often what we're looking for shapes what we're able to see or not see. Right? You're standing, you're looking at the fridge, you've got the door open, and you know exactly what you think that can of Parmesan cheese should look like. And it looks like something different, so you can be staring right at it and not actually see it. And so their expectations seem to make it harder for them to recognize what God was actually doing. But I don't think it's entirely these two disciples' fault that their expectations didn't get met in the way that they were expecting. Remember, Jesus himself shapes these expectations. He walks right up to the line of what they expect him to do and then does something dramatically different. So it's not entirely their fault, and it's not entirely their choice, because I think in addition to unmet expectations, I think it's fair to say that these disciples are probably dealing with some measure of unresolved trauma. Because of the religious significance that crucifixion plays in Christian faith, I think it's hard for us to really acknowledge what crucifixion actually is. It is a public execution. And it's very, very likely that Cleopas and his friend, this was not the first public execution by crucifixion that they had seen. Jesus is not the only person in all of history to be crucified. Lots of people were crucified before Jesus, and people continued to be crucified by the Roman Empire after Jesus. And I think it's likely that these disciples were experiencing some measure of trauma as a result of living under a violent occupation. What does it say about these disciples? In some translations, it says they stopped, their faces downcast. Others are a little more direct. They stood there looking sad. They're just standing there. I think we might have a word for this, or a couple different ways we would describe this. One, we might say these disciples were shell-shocked. They had just witnessed a horrific public execution. Or we might put it in more clinical terms and say these disciples were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Not just the stress and trauma of seeing Jesus crucified, but the stress and trauma that exists living under a violent military occupation. There's a biblical scholar by the name of Richard Horsley who's explored this in pretty great depth, and he describes it this way. He says, the politics of Roman Palestine was set up and maintained by imperial violence. In Galilee during the century before the mission of Jesus, the people suffered repeated conquest with the slaughter of people and the destruction of villages, leaving collective trauma in their wake. When the Galilean and Judean people resisted Roman rule and periodically revolted, Roman armies reconquered them with ever greater vengeance. And so the people, Cleopas and his friend, their parents, their grandparents, they had witnessed an awful, awful lot of violence. They had been victimized by violence. They had witnessed public executions, not just Jesus, but other people that the Roman Empire would crucify to make a public example out of. And so Horsley looks at this history of violence and the trauma that it leaves in its wake, and he borrows a phrase for this cycle of what kept happening over and over and over again. He borrows this phrase and he calls it a spiral of violence. And this phrase, spiral of violence, it comes from a Brazilian bishop in the 1970s during the military dictatorship. His name was Dom Helder Câmara. And he wrote this small but very powerful book called The Spiral of Violence, where he describes what happens to people living under occupation and how their occupiers respond, and how this just repeats the cycle over and over and over again, this spiral of violence. Câmara identifies three phases, or three types of violence in this spiral. The first, what Câmara calls violence one, is often not something that we recognize as violence. It's just seen as the status quo, what we might think of as structural oppression or exploitation. The basic conditions of living under occupation are inherently violent, even if you don't see violent acts necessarily taking place in public. This is what Câmara writes. He says, no one is born to be a slave. No one seeks to suffer injustices, humiliations, and restrictions. But the egoism of some privileged groups drives countless human beings into subhuman conditions, where they suffer restrictions, humiliations, injustices. Without prospects, without hope, their condition is that of slaves. This is, Câmara says, established violence, or what he calls violence one. This is just the default condition that Cleopas and his friend, their peers, their contemporaries, their parents, they had lived under this established structural violence for at least a century. And in Câmara's view, violence attracts violence, namely resistance or revolt, what Câmara calls violence two. So the base, the starting point, the status quo in the society is inherently violent, and then some of the people experiencing that violence respond with violence of their own, violence too. This is often the first thing that we recognize as violence because it looks like violence. It looks like people harming each other in more unexpected ways. It's not structural, it's kind of episodic. But we don't recognize the first violence as, with apologies to Monty Python, we don't recognize it as the violence inherent in the system. But there is violence there, and then that violence is met with counter-violence, resistance, or revolt. But then that violence in turn gets met with even more violence. There's the violence of the oppressors, the violence of the oppressed, met by further violence of the oppressors, what Câmara calls repression or violence three. So do you see the spiral? There's a status quo of violence, of oppression or exploitation. It's met with revolt, revolution, uprising. And then that is met by repression. It is just a spiral of violence, from this type of violence to this type of violence to this type of violence. And the Roman Empire excelled at violence 3. They were particularly adept at repression. They were very, very good at quelling uprisings, revolts, rebellions. Horsley describes it this way. He says, the Romans deliberately used crucifixion, an excruciatingly painful form of execution by torture, on upstart slaves and rebellious provincials. And the purpose of crucifixion was to terrorize the populace into submission. That's why it was done in public. That's why it was particularly gruesome. That's why the bodies were left on the crosses to be eaten by birds and other predators. Right? It was intended to send a message. And the message was, don't you dare respond to our violence with your own violence, because we will meet that with even stronger violence. Living under a violent empire is traumatic. Cleopas and his friend were traumatized by the structural, established violence, violence 1, by the violence that emerged in response to that, and the counter-violence or repression with which that was met. It was just a spiral of violence over and over and over again. They lived in this unresolved trauma of a blood-stained world. And we have a word for that, actually, I think. And it might not be the word that you would think of when we describe this spiral of violence, because it is so normalized in so many cultures and so many contexts. But I think the word that we could use to describe it is we could call it politics. We could say that these folks are living in a particular type of an unredeemed politics. And this unredeemed politics makes it nearly impossible for them to look at Jesus and recognize who they're looking at, because of the expectations that they have, because of the trauma that they've experienced, and because of the cultural norms that they're living with. And so Jesus comes, it seems like he's going to be the one who sparks this uprising, this violence too, that's going to work this time. This time it's going to free us and liberate us, but instead he's crucified, a particularly brutal expression of violence 3. And so they turn and they start going to Emmaus. And Luke doesn't tell us about the significance of Emmaus because I think he assumed that his audience would have known what Emmaus was all about and what it represented. Most of us today, we don't know. We haven't learned this history. So we have to do a little detour to think about the history of the children of Israel and the role that Emmaus had played in the recent history, going back a couple generations before Cleopas and his friend. The story of the people of God is so frequently a story of living under violent occupation by empire. All sorts of different empires. The Egyptians, right? The original OG bad guys in the story. The children of Israel are liberated, freed from them, but that freedom is short-lived. The Assyrians show up and they take over the northern kingdoms. And then the Babylonians show up and they destroy the southern kingdoms. And then the Persians show up, and then after that, the Macedonians, Alexander the Great shows up, and then his descendants, the Seleucids, show up. And each of these empires have different ways of enacting violence number 1. Different ways of oppressing and repressing the populace, extracting resources from them. Some of these empires practice deportation. They come in, they conquer, and they expel people out of their own land. Some practice importation. They come in and conquer and bring in people from other parts of the world who speak different languages and worship different gods. Some of them practice destruction. They come in and they destroy the temple. Some of them practice reconstruction. The Persians say, here's some resources, go refortify Jerusalem and begin rebuilding your temple. Some of them tolerate certain ways of worship, and others try to repress it. And so the children of Israel's history is a long history of being oppressed and exploited by empires. But every now and then, there are moments where they experience a little taste of freedom. And one of those moments had happened a couple hundred years, about 200 years before Cleopas and his friend were walking along this road to Emmaus. The children of Israel were being dominated by the Seleucid Empire, who were not particularly enlightened, shall we say. They didn't have a high view of religious tolerance. The emperor was a man by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Epiphanes means God manifest. He believed himself to be a manifestation of God in the flesh. And he didn't particularly like that his Jewish subjects were unwilling to worship him. And so he set up a program whereby he ordered Jewish priests to ritually sacrifice pigs in their own holy spaces. I mean, think about how brutal and oppressive this is. For people who believe pigs are unclean and believe there is no God but God, here they are being forced to sacrifice pigs in their own holy spaces. It's a particularly offensive way of practicing established violence, what Camara calls violence number 1. And there's this moment where one of these rituals is about to happen, and the priest on duty is a man named Mattathias. And Mattathias is ordered to kill this pig in this holy place, and he refuses. And so the Seleucid soldier standing there turns to his associate, turns to Mattathias' associate, and says, well, if he won't do it, then you do it. You sacrifice this pig. And this guy's willing to do it. He's willing to break what he understands to be the laws of God so as to placate his Seleucid oppressors. And as he's about to sacrifice the pig, Mattathias does something dramatic. It's depicted in this woodcut for us called Mattathias and the Apostate. And Mattathias actually kills this Jewish man who's about to sacrifice this pig. And this act of rebellion, this violence too, it catalyzes an uprising. It first begins as an insurgency, and then under Mattathias' son Judas, who gets the nickname the Hammer or Maccabee, Judas Maccabee actually starts taking on the Seleucid Empire and becomes pretty successful. There's a story that's told that he has an army that he's gathered together. They haven't been all that successful in taking on the Seleucids because they're stronger and better equipped militarily. It hasn't been going all that well, but Judas Maccabeus has his soldiers in this encampment over here, and he comes up with a plan. He says, we're going to make it seem like we've abandoned this camp, and we're going to lure the Seleucids over here to our camp. And while they're coming this way, we're going to go around by this route, and then we're going to take over their camp and steal all their weapons. And it is remarkably successful. Most of the Seleucids are out. The Jewish soldiers under Judas Maccabeus show up, and they defeat the Seleucids, and they take their stuff, and it leads to them actually getting liberation and freedom. And the encampment where the Seleucids had been, where this remarkable victory occurs, it's at Emmaus. So this is where the Maccabean revolt has its first major success. And it leads actually to a period of relative independence. Some of that is because the Jews are more successful militarily. Some of that is because the Greeks are falling apart internally and also having to deal with these upstart Romans. But it all starts, this freedom starts at Emmaus. Violence, too, seems to work this time. They're oppressed, they fight back, and they win. This is the way it's supposed to work. But within this unredeemed politics, this Maccabean dynasty has only about 100 years of relative independence. Because what happens is some of the descendants, once you get a few generations down, some of the descendants of Judas Maccabeus, there are two sons, and they both want to be king. They start fighting with each other, and then each of them independently goes and appeals to Rome. A lot of very complicated things happen. Julius Caesar gets involved. Julius Caesar gets executed. There's a civil war in Rome. A lot of stuff is going on. But the net result is that these two claimants to the Maccabean dynasty end up going to Rome saying, make me king. And what Rome decides to do is saying, neither of you are going to be king. The Maccabean dynasty is over. We are appointing our guy to be in charge of you, and his name is Herod. And so that's the sequence where you go from this relative period of independence, freedom, liberation that starts at Emmaus to another brutal puppet client king named Herod. And then Herod dies, because that's what happens to rulers. And this sparks another power vacuum, and a whole bunch of people go rushing to Rome. Some saying, make me king. Others saying, no, make me king. Others saying, no, abolish the monarchy entirely, get rid of Herod, make us a direct state, a direct province of Rome. All of these folks go to Rome to plead their case, to try to become powerful in their own region. And while that's happening, there's this guy. He literally is just kind of a nobody. He's a shepherd, actually. But he's tall and he's pretty strong. And his name is Athrongeus, if you can believe it or not. It's a tough name to say. So he's this shepherd. He's not part of the royal dynasty. He's not anybody. He's a shepherd, but he's tall and he's strong. And so while all the ruling leaders are out in Rome pleading their case, put me in charge, Athrongeus says, well, why don't I be in charge? And so he puts a diadem on his head, and he says, I'm king now. And he actually gets a following, enough of a following that a historian named Josephus tells us about his story. And he gathers some folks together, and there's still all the leading politicians, they're out of town, but the Roman army is still there. But this is what Josephus says. He says, once Athrongeus attacked a Roman company, soldiers who were bringing grain and weapons to the army, and they fell upon Arius the centurion, who commanded the company. And they killed 40 of his best foot soldiers. And the other Romans panicked after this slaughter, left their dead behind them, and fled. And where does this nobody upstart Athrongeus achieve this victory? Emmaus. This is the place you go to go on another cycle through the spiral of violence. Right? Emmaus is a place where you can win unexpected victories against foreign occupiers and defeat them militarily. And so I think the disciples, Cleopas and his friend, these two folks who were seeking to follow Jesus, this nobody upstart who seemed like maybe he could be the one who liberates and frees them from Roman oppression, that fails. And so what do? They start walking back to Emmaus, the place where the Maccabean revolt had its first major victory, the place where this guy named Athrongeus drives out some Roman centurions, which is not a thing that's supposed to happen. They are going back thinking maybe this is the space, maybe this is the place. It didn't work out with Jesus, but surely there's going to be someone else who rises up, puts a crown on his head, gets some weapons, and is successful. We are going to experience the liberation we desire by taking another spin on this spiral of violence. That's where they're headed. Their unmet expectations, their unresolved trauma, and their unredeemed politics all have oriented them away from what God is actually doing, back toward trying to achieve their own victory on their own terms. They're going back to Emmaus, the place where unexpected military victories happen and sometimes even lead to freedom. The road to Emmaus is a road back to an unredeemed politics. And there are an awful lot of people in Jesus' day, and likely in our day, who walk that road, who are not content with what God is actually doing in the world, and the ways God is actually bringing about liberation and freedom and deliverance. It doesn't look the way we want it to. It doesn't meet our expectations. And so we start walking back thinking maybe somewhere on this spiral of violence, as we do it for the 1,000th time, the 10,000th time, the millionth time, one of these times we're going to get it right and we're actually going to experience what we want. And so what is it that keeps us from recognizing Jesus? Unmet expectations. It doesn't look like what we want it to look like. Unresolved trauma. We have lived in a world of violence, and we have experienced and observed violence. We have perpetrated violence knowingly and unknowingly. We carry this trauma in our bodies. And our unredeemed politics, thinking that maybe violence actually is the solution. We just go on this spiral one more time, and this time, surely it'll work. But this road to Emmaus is not the road to Jesus. It is not the road of faithfulness. It is not following faithfully in Jesus' footsteps. There is no hope in that spiral of violence. It cannot actually resolve the problems that we face. But people walk it, and they walk it, and they walk it. And here's what I find so amazing about this story. That Jesus, who has been raised bodily from the dead, who has been established conclusively to be God's chosen Messiah, God's chosen liberator, he sees these disciples walking exactly in the wrong direction, going toward exactly the wrong things, going back to the violence that cannot save them, that just killed Jesus. He sees them walking in this direction, and Jesus follows them. They are not following Jesus, but Jesus is following them. Well, they have these unmet expectations, this unresolved trauma, their unredeemed politics. They are unable to see what God is actually doing. Jesus is following after them. As they are going in precisely the wrong direction, Jesus is walking along with them. And so if we have these things, if our expectations don't align with what God's actually doing, if we aren't sure how to deal with the trauma that we've experienced or inflicted, if our politics are just fundamentally broken, and yet we keep walking in that direction, maybe Jesus is walking with us. And maybe Jesus is trying to reveal himself to us. Maybe Jesus wants to open the scriptures to us and say, this is what it actually looks like when God acts decisively to liberate and free and redeem and restore the world. And what ultimately seals the deal for these disciples, what opens their eyes, is this act of hospitality, of sharing a meal. Remember, this is a tense political situation. There's still the specter of violence. They've just seen a man get crucified because Rome thought he was trying to lead another insurrection, another turn on the spiral of violence. And here's this stranger walking along with them. They don't know if they should trust him or not trust him. They don't know anything. But they stop. They get to Emmaus. And Jesus is like, okay, see ya. Keeps walking. We say, no, it's late. Please stay here. Let's have a meal. Even in the midst of walking in the wrong direction, these disciples seek to extend hospitality to a stranger. And Jesus meets them in this act of hospitality. So he went in to stay with them. And after he took a seat at the table with them, what does he do? He reenacts the Passover supper. He takes bread, he blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to them. just like he had done for his disciples in the upper room before his crucifixion. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. But he disappeared from their sight. And so we're going to move into a time of communion now to remember and commemorate this act of Jesus, this act of hospitality by these two disciples walking in the wrong direction, this act of receiving hospitality and extending hospitality by both the disciples and Jesus. We are going to trust that we can actually meet and see Christ in this meal.